An only child, born into a prosperous middle-class family, Noel Scott Engel was born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1943, living all over the United States as the family shadowed his father's successful oil industry career. Traumatized by his parents' dysfunctional and abusive relationship and his mother's subsequent nervous breakdown, he took an early interest in acting, landing his first professional role in a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical at age 12. He even released his first single a couple of years later before settling in Hollywood with his mother in 1959 following his parents' divorce. He fell in love with classical and jazz music while studying the double bass and also became obsessed with European cinema, particularly the work of Ingmar Bergman, Federico Fellini and Robert Bresson. All this time he continued to pick up stage acting gigs and was pushed as a teen idol by various industry shucksters, coming this close to the big time under the mentorship of Eddie Fisher, at the time Liz Taylor's fourth husband, before quitting showbiz for the first of many times at age 19 in 1962. Turning his back on teen stardom, he then cut his teeth as a session musician, over time becoming proficient enough on multiple instruments to back up dozens of major stars on record. He fell in with another youthful showbiz all-rounder, John Moss, together deciding that they looked similar enough to each other to justify presenting themselves as a family act, and thus the Walker Brothers were born. And while the Walker Brothers brushed up against hip, up-and-coming LA groups like the Byrds and Arthur Lee's Love on the Sunset Strip, Scott in particular was far more taken with the tuxedoed, adult sophistication of crooner Jack Jones, who he more or less modelled himself on going forward. This is important as Jack Jones is the first of three influential figures who Scott basically intersected with artistically over the years in a way that kind of explains what Scott Walker is and the about-turns he took in his career. Obviously, the crooner aesthetic of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin and Nat King Cole speaks to an older, pre-rock and roll world of middle-aged men in tailored suits, loose tires and with a drink in one hand, singing mostly love songs to a jazz or orchestral backing. Musically, and this is particularly relevant to Scott's style in the wider context of rock, is the idea of a crooner being an intimate and soft style of singer. A style only made possible by the invention of modern microphones, something iconic crooner and notoriously unpleasant human being, Bing Crosby, personally had a major hand in. In Scott's case, this approach naturally suits him as a baritone singer, as lower-pitched voices are not only naturally quieter voices, but they simply don't cut through the midiness of guitars, drums, and other rock-oriented instrumentation. This is why someone like Jim Morrison is actually quite rare in the rock world. But of course, back in 1964, Scott was yet to fully develop this persona of his, and the Walker Brothers, of course, formed during the key year for Beatlemania. Therefore, now that we're in the era of beat groups, it stands to reason that Scott and John sought to provide their own instrumental backing on bass and guitar respectively, to be joined shortly after by mop-topped drummer Gary Leeds. In fact, at this point, Scott was not even supposed to be the main singer in the Walker Brothers. The idea was for his baritone to give John's more strident tenor harmonic support within the group. While still in the US, they were soon offered a recording contract before promptly deciding to up sticks and move to England in early 1965 as their chosen pathway to fame and success. And after slumming it and nearly giving up after 3 wintry London months, the Walker Brothers got their first big break, filling in for the Kinks on a tour supporting the Yardbirds, after a famous incident where Kinks drummer Mick Avery almost decapitated guitarist Dave Davies in an onstage fight. Initially, the Walker Brothers stage show was just the 3 of them and their instruments, eventually employing a backing group named the Quotations to do the bulk of the instrumental heavy lifting, while Scott and John in particular threw shapes to the delight of their mostly teenage fans. While Gary played drums live, his role in the group was mostly as something of a primitive hype man, with John singing lead on the rockier numbers and Scott on the ballads. This meant that Scott was the lead voice on the bulk of their hit singles, including the Phil Spector-inspired Make It Easy on Yourself and The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore, both climbing to number 1 in the UK charts and doing reasonably well back in the US also. In true 1960s fashion, the Walker Brothers secured management with dodgy underworld connections, and under the guidance of Svengali and now disgraced nonce Jonathan King, Phillips AR man John Franz, producer Peter Olive, and arrangers Reg Guest and Ivor Raymond, released 3 excellent studio albums in their short career. In 1965's Take It Easy with the Walker Brothers, 1966's Portrait, and 1967's Images. All 3 are great examples of the high-quality British pops before Sgt. Pepper properly ushered in the album's era, full of variety, up-tempo soul covers, brooding wall of sound orchestral ballads, country and western, jazz and easy listening, all written and produced by the very best in the business, with the occasional writing contribution from Scott himself. Perfectly enjoyable records, the style of which has been mostly swept away in the subsequent rock era. The Walker Brothers' brand of neurotic romanticism, providing a sonic and thematic blueprint for Scott's impending solo career. And it was on the strength of this music that the Walker Brothers became household names in the UK, with at one point, at least, having a bigger fan club than that of the Beatles. And like the Beatles, Walkermania saw the group regularly being mobbed by thousands of screaming girls at their gigs and outside their homes, to the point where they resorted to using decoy cars and wearing disguises when out in public. Proper Hard Day's Night stuff. For John and Gary, it was all a bit of a laugh. Scott found this extreme level of fame deeply disturbing, however. And while the idea of an all-American pop group reaching this kind of success seems a little out of place now, it's certainly not an unusual trajectory in the history of rock and roll. This is what I describe as the curious phenomenon of the transatlantic musical pipeline. Jimi Hendrix is the most notable example of this, and perhaps best demonstrates how and why it worked. As someone who couldn't get arrested stateside, for Hendrix to be dropped into swinging but still quite austere London in 1966 must have seemed like he was genuinely from outer space or from the future, and only after conquering that market in a few short months was he allowed to go back to the US as the all-conquering hero. And as well as the Walker Brothers, you have James Taylor, Chrissie Hynde, and Suzi Quatro making their names in the UK first, and a great number of failed attempts to do so in the proto-punk and punk eras. And as recently as the grunge and meet me in the bathroom indie era, this was still a thing, with the Strokes, the White Stripes and the Killers hitting it big in the UK first before hitting it big in their homeland. The fawning of the UK press was also critical to the Foo Fighters' international breakthrough. That's right, England, the Foo Fighters are your fault. Another American who went on to make his name in England is, of course, Harry Nilsson, who shared more than a bit in common with our boy Scott, despite, as far as I know, never running into each other. For starters, like Scott, Harry Nilsson was, of course, an excellent songwriter who shot to fame mostly singing other people's songs, both of them in many ways being at least partly relics of the Tin Pan Alley approach to entertainment. Both of them also effectively refused to perform live despite their incredible talent and presence, and while I can't speak for Harry, Scott at least gave it his best in the early years, even if his fear of performing was generally far greater than Harry's, having to be either persuaded to go out on stage by others or getting pissed up before going out. And that also leads to their mutual dependence on alcohol, something I would argue is not a coincidence considering their respective connections to the UK. Take it from me, the UK is to this day a drunkard's dream. And whether or not you believe in Harry and Scott's case that it can be traced back to childhood trauma, which of course was very real for them, living in the UK as I do, you become accustomed not just to an overly permissive drinking culture, but also the presumption that everyone is a heavy drinker. And I say that as an Australian. While obviously drinking and smoking in Western culture is nothing like what it once was, I have seen Mad Men after all. The UK didn't quite get the self-improvement, clean living bug that the US did from the 80s onwards, except for Gen Z, who basically can't afford to have fun anymore. At a guess, it's probably just a way of coping with the weather here, especially the further north that you go. So while again, like Nilsson, alcohol came to increasingly dominate Scott's life later on as the hits dried up, boozing was of course a decidedly unhip indulgence in the mid to late 60s as swinging London turned to pot and LSD as the zeitgeisty habits of choice. But Scott outright dismissed the use of drugs at the time and saw the perhaps pretentious romance in staying up all night reading Hemingway, Dickens and Dylan Thomas by candlelight with a bottle of scotch in hand. But it was more than that for Scott, a crutch under the increasing pressure of extreme fame, his fear of performing, fear of flying and increased paranoia leading up to Scott's first suicide attempt in 1966. While John Moss also went on to have his own battle with the bottle, all of these pressures sought to pull the Walker brothers apart, who, let's not forget, the oldest of whom was only 25 years old at the time, just before the summer of love and psychedelia came to dominate music on both sides of the Atlantic. They managed a tour of Singapore, Japan and Australia, and a final package tour of the UK featuring Jimi Hendrix, Cat Stevens and Engelbert Humperdinck before imploding. And in a fairly on-brand move for Scott, he decamped to a Benedictine monastery on the Isle of Wight to study Gregorian chant and lick his wounds while plotting a solo career. It was around this time that Scott fell under the spell of the second most significant musical figure in his life after Jack Jones, that being the Belgian chanson singer and actor Jacques Brel. Brel's theatrical approach, working exclusively in French of course, from the start of his career in the mid-50s to his major rise to fame a full decade later, was his dramatic and tortured approach to performing, with dark and stormy songs about the depths of human depravity and destruction, clearly an enormous influence on Scott. So much so that despite supposedly never meeting in person, Brel officially endorsed Scott Walker as his spiritual heir, instructing American writer Mort Schumann to translate Brel's songs exclusively into English for Scott's benefit. Using much of the same production crew as the Walker Brothers albums, Scott's first solo record, the inventively titled Scott, was released in mid-1967 and featured 3 Brel compositions including album opener Matilda, My Death, and perhaps Brel's most famous song, Amsterdam. It's an excellent record with a pleasing stylistic variety, up-tempo cinematic romps, a taste of country and western, soaring ballads, and just a bit of schmaltzy filler. Nothing that I personally have a problem with. Reaching an impressive number 3 on the UK chart for a solo debut, as a statement of intent, it speaks to Scott's decidedly European black and white aesthetic, released smack bang in the summer of love and at its explosion of Paisley. And personally, as a foreigner living in the UK, in my humbleness, the only commonality between Scott and myself that I would dare to point out, I have a lot of sympathy with Scott's clear romantic longing for life on the continent. For people born and raised here, I'm sure it seems unremarkable, but I'm sure most others would agree that the lure of Europeanness is really seductive for outsiders, especially people like myself and our main man Scott, who feel like they came from the middle of nowhere. Europe is somewhere, very often somewhere impossibly beautiful. Have you ever sat in a cafe in Paris and watched the afternoon sun move across the city's ornate architecture, sipping a glass of wine while an old man plays an accordion on the cobblestone street corner, to the indifference of well-dressed commuters? Some of the most romantic memories of my life have been from doing nothing more than observing life in that grimy, stinking city of love. When Joanna loved me, every town was Paris. Paris on a Sunday. Every month was May. And that's just Paris. And that's just Paris. Most European cities are like this in one way or the other. For people like me, it's like being in a movie. And despite everything, this Europe still exists and is inviting all of us to fall in love again. So no wonder Scott 1 was a hit, despite Scott's best efforts to sabotage it as he so often did, refusing to tour it beyond a handful of cabaret appearances and TV spots, which he also hated. His second album, released in early 1968, given the inspired title of Scott 2, indeed reached number 1 in the UK and represents Scott's commercial career peak. Like its predecessor, it includes an obligatory Tim Hardin tune and several Jacques Brel compositions, old Jacques providing some of the most brutal and in many ways offensive language you could ever imagine on a number 1 pop record in 1968. Now, I always will recall the brothel truck, the flying flags, the queer lieutenant who slapped our asses as if we were fags. I swear on the wet head of my first case of gonorrhea, it's his ugly voice that I forever hear. And then later on, one day I'll cut my legs off and burn myself alive. I'll do anything, anything just to survive and never to be next.
Next!
Jackie, the album's lead single, also written by Jacques Brel, was also banned by the BBC for its reference to authentic queers and phony virgins and other references to drugs. And alongside that, the underworld and oftentimes hellish imagery is a flavour of a playful, surreal psychedelia, especially on tracks like The Amorous Humphrey Plug and Plastic Palace People, both written by Scott himself. It's a fantastic album, and were it not for it actually selling really well at the time, I would have been tempted to make it the subject of this video. I'll say as well, the second track, Best of Both Worlds, gets my vote for being Scott's single finest vocal performance.
I can satisfy you. You want best of both worlds. Make your fickle mind up. I won't stay while you enjoy best of both worlds.
In typical Scott fashion, he claimed to hate the record, declaring it the work of a lazy, self-indulgent man. He nonetheless found a degree of happiness with his Danish girlfriend and later wife, Mette Tybug, settling into a routine of sporadic live appearances strictly for the sake of keeping the wolf from the door. Released in early 1969, the cunningly titled Scott 3 saw him turn away from the big, bombastic orchestrations of his previous two albums, also composing the majority of its tracks himself for a change. While it is fantastic and near perfect, Two Ragged Soldiers perhaps being my personal favourite track on it, Scott 3 is noticeably slower and sombre compared to Scott's previous works, something reflected in its muted reception, reaching a paltry number 3 in the UK charts. Off the back of this, amazingly, Scott was given his own weekly BBC television show where he got to sing songs and have guests on in a controlled setting that helped to ease his natural stage fright. The resultant album, Scott Sings Songs from his TV show, is a good example of someone in the rock idiom doing what is essentially a classics or standards album, one that his vocal coach Freddie Winrose at least believes to be Scott's high watermark as a singer. He was extremely busy in this year, producing other artists in the background and travelling back and forth between London, Copenhagen and Amsterdam with his young bride-to-be. Scott 3's comparatively low sales somehow convinced Scott his next album needed to be more indulgent rather than less. And considering avant-garde and psychedelic music was very much in the air at the time, I can sympathise with that rationale. Although I would say Scott's undoing was having to straddle that fine line between the teeny bopper pop that brought him to fame and the underground sounds that were clearly steering the culture in 1969. He certainly didn't help himself by declaring that he would drop his stage name and release his next record under his birth name of Scott Engel. Big mistake, pal. Scott 4 was released in November 1969 under Scott's birth name, Scott Engel, with little to no fanfare, not helped at all by his own refusal to tour and Philip's refusal to promote the record. Indeed, the record label was growing tired of his increasingly uncommercial output, having made such a strong start to his solo career. And his hitherto loyal fans agreed, turned off by Scott 4's sombre atmosphere and pretentious lyrics. Scott had also severed ties with his manager Maurice King just prior to the album's release, and its mixed reviews and poor sales saw Scott 4 deleted shortly after initial release. Deeply hurt by the reception his masterpiece received, Scott virtually withdrew from public life, spending more and more of his time bar hopping across Europe, claiming once again to have quit music entirely, once again. However, after about a year, he made a concession to the record label with 1970's Till the Band Comes In, returning to the previous, more successful formula of mixing original material with covers. On this one, he leans further into trad jazz and country influences, and I adore this album and consider it a key part of his original classic run of solo records. And I don't really go for the popular argument that it's significantly let down by its second side. I mean, sure, it's a bit schlocky, but I think it feels worse for having followed the original genius of Scott 4, and is therefore judged unfairly in comparison. And I would say that argument really only works if you find schlock that offensive. Scott always walked the fine line between artistic genius and middle-of-the-road mawkishness, and personally, I'm pretty immune to that. To my ears, his voice sells whatever he is singing. That's how good he is. A bad song is good if sung by the right singer. To quote from the Big Star documentary that came out a few years ago, I'd rather hear Alex Chilton sing Volare for the millionth time than have to listen to Arcade Fire. And I can't help but agree with that. But in all fairness, Scott increasingly came down on the wrong side of that line for the first half of the 70s, releasing a string of mostly easy listening, movie-themed standards and country music albums as his audience went down and his drinking went up. Unlike Scott 4, which was of course rediscovered many years later, these albums were properly buried until after his death, almost impossible to find, and I've only just seen them appear on Spotify for the first time in this year, 2025. In all honesty, they are mostly, at worst, pleasant listens, if inessential. He reunited with the Walker Brothers for 3 creatively mixed and commercially disappointing albums between 1975 and 78. The last of these, Nite Flights, containing 4 Scott originals, his first since 1970s till the band comes in. And in these 4 tracks, especially The Electrician, we hear the terrifying sound that came to form the basis for his entire latter-day career. It took him another 6 years to produce a full-length album along these lines, with 1984's Climate of Hunter, then another 11 years until really finding his new niche with Tilt in 1995. And by niche, I mean Scott came to produce music that was punishingly industrial, bleak and scary. It's incredible stuff, but far from tuneful, tuneless for the most part, and fans of his early work best be warned. I think it's powerful and forward-thinking, not just because it again so thoroughly defies definition, but because at the centre of it all is Scott's incredible, unshakably powerful voice. While he was never as prolific in his late career as he was in the 1960s, he clearly fell in love with music again in later life, releasing The Drift in 2006, Bish Bosh in 2012 and Soused in 2014. While I am not intimately familiar with all of these, The Drift is the one I've gravitated towards with its nightmarish revisionist history lyrics and outside-the-box production that includes punching slabs of meat and squeezing donkeys into microphones. There's a particular moment in the song The Escape that really made me shit myself the first time I heard it. If you know, you know. It's horror music. That's the best way to describe it. And if anything, it adds to the underlying darkness of his more pop-oriented 60s work, as Scott's personal torment is the common thread throughout both distinct phases of his career. It's interesting to think that his music only got increasingly darker as he grew older and made peace with his life and his art, enjoying a warm, if relatively unglamorous cult figure anonymity alongside alternative rock elder statesman status, buoyed in no small part by an ever-growing interest in his 60s work. The seeds of this were planted in 1981 when Julian Cope first compiled Fire Escape in the Sky, the Godlike Genius of Scott Walker compilation, beginning the revival of Scott's critical fortunes. David Bowie went on to cover some of his late period work, acknowledging Scott's enormous influence on his own career. I consider David Bowie to be the 3rd key figure in understanding Scott Walker after Jack Jones and Jacques Brel. Not, however, because of Bowie's effect on Scott, but instead Scott's effect on Bowie. It's of course widely acknowledged that so much of Bowie's genius is in his ability to co-opt, or perhaps less charitably, steal bits of other artistic personas to fold into his own, not least of all Jacques Brel also. But personally, the more I got to understand Scott and Bowie, the more apparent to me just how much of Scott is in Bowie's voice, his stage manner, and his songwriting, especially his Thin White Duke and Berlin Trilogy phases. I'd even go so far as to say Bowie's swan song and horror jazz masterpiece, Black Star, could not be more late-period Scott-coded if he tried. Scott Walker passed away from cancer at age 76 in 2019 in London, the city he first made his home at the age of 22. If you liked this video, please do me a favour and hit the like button, but if you didn't, rather than hit the dislike button, can I suggest you leave a comment and let me know why? I'm always open to feedback, advice and opinions that challenge mine, plus it apparently helps me game YouTube's algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it will let you know whenever I put something new up. You can follow me on all the socials if you're so inclined, and if you'd like to incentivize me with a $5 a month to continue doing these videos, a link to my Patreon should be just beneath this video. Cheers.